actually, I'm interested in what your just from background. Ralph has been telling bits and pieces about you.
In 1961 or 2, I'm not sure. 1960, my then husband Ed Pearl opened a club in Los Angeles in Ash Grove, right? And through that club came a lot of people who were being found by folks like Ralph and John Cohen and Mike Seeger and others in the South who had recorded in the 1920s and 30s and not been heard of since, as well as a lot of the folk revival people. Although the club's emphasis in both Ed's and my fascination was really with the vernacular music of the country and not particularly with the revival folks. Ed and I went up to Berkeley for the teach-ins on the Vietnam War. We were politically involved with the Peace and Freedom Party, so we were part of that general cultural thing. We married Ralph in February of '71 and produced and did all the field work for the children's area of the festival in Copipe, and have, I guess, attended almost every festival since then. So I've seen the evolution of the festival. And I'm co-authoring a book with Ralph, which is his autobiography, but I'm writing it.
Well, they did it.
He hasn't got the time to write it, so I'm writing it. So I may know some things more than I would have if I had happened to be involved in the Baby Prize.
Well, also what's interesting, because part of this all is this commercialism aspect of the fact that these clubs sprung up and now they're there and they bring these people up from the South. People were coming to see them. That's a whole part of this that we'd like to include. I mean, there's something that was never there before.
But another thing, Ralph and I were both involved in the civil rights movement. That's, I would say, perhaps the most important component in terms of things that you could look at. I would look at Mileston, Mississippi, and the festival that the Newport Foundation put money into that Ralph helped to put in place in Mileston is like the key thing. Maybe the cultural work that Ralph did in Cajun country, also under the auspices of Newport. So, that by taking Newport as a central thing for this interview, I think it became a very important thing because it was a crossroads between those people who were devoted to vernacular music and those people who were devoted to drawing people for the commercial interests who were the promoters of folk revival singers. I mean, that's what Newport was for. But there was a whole nother set of people influencing what happened at Newport and what the Newport Folk Foundation did that I think could take you off in a whole nother extremely, since I consider the civil rights movement more important than the folk revival movement myself. And there is an absolute direct link, there with Newport. It makes it a risk.
Before we asked you anything specific, I was wondering if you had anything that came to your mind while I was talking, actually. I'm sorry.
Let's just go right into what questions are.
Okay. Newport initially, as I understand it, was a commercial endeavor between Al Grossman and George Warren in the 50s, and that we and George Warren and others in the 50s, and that were you involved in that at all at the inception, either as a participant or as a...
No, I was never interested, particularly in commercial books on the island. When that happened, I was aware of it. When I listened to the folk racing thing on records, but it wasn't something that I really wanted to go to.
Right. And then, in '63, as I gather, or prior to the '63 festival, they formed the band. They decided to revamp it. I wanted to get a little more understanding of what was the revamping that went on, what the goals were.
I think Kate can tell the story based on Peggy's involvement with Toshi and Pete from a conversation that you had with Toshi, right? Seeger?
And Peggy.
And Peggy.
Well, yeah,
I was involved
general
in that.
feeling is that Peggy said that there should be more of the traditional and vernacular music because they were only representing the people who were exploiting the music to make a career in commercializing material which was basically not commercial before. And I don't think that Peggy was the least bit alone in that. I mean, it was the general feeling with Pete and Mike Seeger and Alan Lomax and others. I mean, I even think probably Peter, Paul, and Mary, who was on the board, would have certainly.
He was on the board later.
He certainly would have supported that notion. I don't think anybody in the revival would have said that wasn't a good idea. There were people later who toured with blues musicians with their bands because they thought it was a wonderful idea to take them with them, and probably knew that their music was better than the revival music.
Yeah, I'm sure the Rolling Stones and people like that realized that the people that
But
inspired
anyway,
them were more interesting than they were.
the idea did come up then of creating the Newport Folk Foundation and what to do with it. But I mean, Ralph should speak on this. You were there.
So headed, okay.
What happened? Well, the first Newport Festival sprang from a concert that the Kingston Trio did at the 58 Newport Folk Festival. I guess that 58 was the year.
Jazz Festival.
Jazz Festival. The year that had Kingston Trio made their head with Tom Dooley. And they so far outgrew anything else at the Jazz Festival that George realized that something else was in order. Since Grossman already had a club, the Native Horn in Chicago, and George put together Newport themselves with advice from people. George I think, already had a board for the Jazz Festival. People like Bill Lord and Bob O'Connor, jazz critics, and musicians. George was an unusually dedicated and sensitive producer himself, and extremely imaginative, but very dedicated to the people and not to the dollar. He was successful, but he was successful despite the fact that he really put other guys first. So the first Newport Folk Festival already had interesting stuff on it. The first two. The second one was closed by a riot. And when it came back, I think it was Peggy and Ewan were at the second one. And it was on the way back to Beacon, I think, Toshi said that she and Peggy had a discussion in the car that led to a concept of revamping Newport, but that didn't actually happen until the spring of '63. And although she's not very often credited with it, Toshi Seeger had an enormous amount to do with the kind of democratic, populist design of how everything got done. She dealt with a lot of logistic perspectives, housing, feeding, transporting, making sure people didn't get lost in the shuffle if they didn't have managers and booking agents to look out for them. When you were going to have a lot of traditional people who weren't represented by professional agents. Toshi's role in all of that was significant, highly significant. So was Joyce Green's. Joyce continued on the spot always to George's wife to handle the logistical side of the festival. But it was done very much in a family way. It wasn't done like a big business. It had a very nice quality that way. All the churches. The '63 Newport Folk Festival was the first under the new board of directors of the foundation. and it made somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000. Not money for that era. And it was set up with a board of directors that included Yarrow and Lomax, Bert Darling. Well, that's all right. And after that festival, Lomax, in the fall of that year, talked to Mike Seeger. And Mike called me up and asked me if I would talk with him and Alan about the possibility of working for the board as a field worker. He had dinner, and Alan has a different recollection of this if you've ever talked to him about it. He says he rode around with me in a car and refused to get out until they let me off. I don't remember who he thought was driving, until I agreed to do this, but that's not what happened. I remember very clearly. He told us this story a couple of months ago. But we had dinner at an Italian restaurant in the village, and then went up to Alan's apartment across the street, and he wrote up a page designing what would be essentially a field program. Not two very eloquent paragraphs, maybe three. It was all on one page. About a month later, in January of '64, I was hired at about $175 a month a week, plus expenses, to go traveling around the country finding grassroots artists. Some of whom had been recognized and recorded, found and forgotten, and others who may never have been heard, and to stimulate community activity at the grassroots level. What that was supposed to mean. Well, I went to Alan and asked him how he'd go about doing this, and he spent a lot of time, over a day or two, giving me names and ideas and all kinds of suggestions about how you go about doing things. I had worked at Swarthmore College, organizing the folk festival there as an undergraduate. That festival tradition went back to the 40s, Lydian Rebellion. By that time, 1963, I had spent a few years in graduate school in Europe and lived in London for a while with A.L. Lloyd, traditional florist. Recorded with him in New London. Was part of the folk circuit in London, performing at pubs with that group of people. So I had a sense of that revival. That's where I met Alan. In fact, he was hiding out from McCarthy era at the time, 1956 and 7. So by the time I got to '63, I'd known Alan for 6 years. Known Pete for 10, and Mike and Peggy. And I was fairly clear on what the revival was. I'd worked for Folkways, writing notes and transcribing stuff for them. And I got on a short tour with Pete to see how it would be possible to set up folk clubs as he wanted to do it. And when I got out of college, he asked me if I wanted to do this. We got in the station wagon and went to Philadelphia and came to concert and I sold records, and then the next day we had a meeting and talked with the Philadelphia folk song enthusiasts about organizing into an organization, a club, a society. And, well, nothing came out of that meeting immediately because I went off to graduate school and didn't stay there to attend that kind of thing. The basic idea Pete had was that someone would travel around and organize. So the point of all this is that seeds had been planted in my own mind as to what activist roles might be vis-a-vis the folks on the Bible. Politically, I was never involved with any particular parties, but I was always drawn to the far left perspectives. It's fair to say, certainly during the McCarthy era, everyone was polarized. I was polarized to the left from the very outset, I remember. pumpkin papers and some, I guess, Chambers earrings. So by the time 1963 came, I had been involved with the folk song revival for 10 years and learned to play the men by watching Woody in Washington Square. Lived in Europe and seen that revival, a very different one. The French folk song revival hadn't yet begun, although I lived in France for a while. Saw new record companies spring up like Tradition and Prestige, parallel what Folkways had been doing, but I was involved with Folkways when Mike was starting to do field work in 55 and 6, and so I had a sense that there was a real movement, and that people like Charles Seeger, who was a very generous mentor from the time I first met him in 54, summer 54, I guess, kind of took you under his wing and made you a colleague. You weren't a kid his son's age. You were just another person who was a potential guided missile as far as Charlie was concerned. There was a lot of history, which I don't need to go into more detail on, but I was very much shaped by my uncles, my maternal uncle, his older, younger brother. I'd gone to Harvard and studied with the same people that Seeger and Lomax studied with, George Washington Kittredge.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw what the academic side of folklore was from the time I was a kid, because I heard folk song records, Library of Congress, and Maria and Miranda, Girl Wives, and Larry Bennett, poems from the mid-30s on. So by the time Newport got started, I was a guided missile because of my uncle's interests and knowing about Kittredge as a legend and having heard folk music from the age of 7 years old. I remember it very well. It shaped my aesthetic. But my aesthetic was shaped by the tradition more than by the popular singers. Richard Dyer Bennett, I think I sat on an album of his records. I broke by mistake, but not with any sorrow, the Maria and Miranda collection of 78s. But most of the Library of Congress stuff and all of those older recordings I still have, the old 78s of that stuff. And to me, that was really magical stuff.
Where did you grow up?
Passaic, New Jersey, across from New York City.
The only 8-year-old listening to that stuff?
Yeah, Passaic, New Jersey, certainly. So when I was asked to do this, as formless as the ideas may sound in a written document of Lomax's, they sounded poetic and exciting, but how do you stimulate grassroots culture at the roots? Well, I got in a car and went first to the place that made these cups. It just happens to be sitting here. But when I bought Mike Seeger a wedding present, and I was not very affluent at the time, I looked all over and I found these very cups. This one was made at the same time in 1960 at a shop in Greenwich Village after looking all over the city. And these cups looked to me like the music that we both liked sounded. I don't know why. And I found out a year or two later that they came from the very center of the area where the music we liked most was richest. It's a strange thing. There was something about the irregularity of the cup and the simplicity of it and the glaze and the bumpiness of it. And it's indeed a pottery that was established 6 or 7 generations earlier by people of Dutch origin in eastern Kentucky, right near where the first Library of Congress record that I ever got as a kid had been recorded in 1937. It's a mystical thing. You could look at a pot and see an oral aesthetic in a sense.
That's amazing.
And this is the very mug that I bought for myself at the same time. So I went to that place because I desperately wanted to see the people who had been on those records. And I met the one who came from the place near his pottery, the little man or so his pottery, in Sandersville, Basil May. And visited the people at Margot Mayo and had recorded, her cousin Rufus Crisp, who had taught Pete how to use the fifth string on the banjo. His son, Palmer Crisp, was still alive. And I started to piece together the kind of physical geography of things that had only been sounds for me. I never thought I'd see those people when I was a little child. I think I was in China. But it was an intensely exciting time because what was happening at the same time that I was attaching a sense of geography and humanity to these sounds, because when you hear a recording, you have no sense of what kind of people, how they smile, how they look, how they talk, how they think, make those kinds of sounds. And I went from there. What I was putting together was that kind of sense. At the same time that I was trying to figure out why folklorists recorded music and didn't look at objects at the same time, because the objects seemed to make a basket like that one, or a pot, a piece of hand weaving. All of it seemed as significant to me as the sounds. It just seemed to be part of the same aesthetic and the same oral tradition for transmission. It all depended on the same continuity of culture. And I was just feeling my way there. I hadn't studied this at Swarthmore, because Swarthmore didn't have a program of folklore at the time. And whatever Penn had, I wasn't aware of. And even so, when people studied folklore at that point, they got very little material culture. It was mostly songs, texts, oral history, oral literature, beliefs, myths, superstitions. The folk life movement came later, resulting from the efforts of other senior colleagues down the other way. But I was doing that in my head because I hadn't done the reading of that. And I went to some of the people that Alan suggested I talk to. And one of them was an elderly scholar, John Quincy Wolfe, lying in the hospital dying of arthritis. He was crippled. And he told me about a very vague recollection he had of a black man who played panpipes in southern Alabama. He always wanted to follow up on a plantation near Dothan, Alabama, but he'd never been well enough to travel down there. And I headed straight for it. He was the person who had, John Quincy Wolfe had enabled Alan to connect with the people that he recorded in '59 on his Prestige and Atlantic record, sponsored record recording trip. We recorded Jimmy Driftwood and Almeda River, went back and revisited people we hadn't seen since the 40s. And John Quincy Wolfe's advice was very good. He sent me to Almeda Riddle as well. And I went south and found the man and recorded him and brought him to Newport along with a blues singer, Willie Doss. That was the height of the civil rights movement in 1964, and I was aware, while I worked on that year a workshop that Highlander Folk Center did involving people that Alan had recorded earlier on that Prestige Atlantic trip. On my own, I didn't have any sense of how I, as an individual, could go into a black community and organize anything. One of the things that really needed to be organized were being organized by the community itself. And I was aware of that from Highlander's work. So I went on to Louisiana, not seeing anything that needed my organizing in Alabama, but stopping in Arkansas and seeing there organizing that Jimmy Driftwood had done within his own community. He had just made a big hit with about New Orleans on record. And he was taking the profits from that song and putting it into the possibility of a folk center in his hometown of Mountain View, Arkansas. And he had a festival there. So I went to see what that was about. And I saw an interesting model for community self-cultural self-recognition. And began to get a sense of the small bits of things that were useful in establishing cultural renewal program. That was the nascent idea in my mind. Then I went to Louisiana, and there I was absolutely astounded with the extraordinary richness and variety of the musical activity, because there were people from little kids to people in their 80s on up, playing fiddles and accordions and triangles and singing pop Cajun stuff and ancient Cajun stuff. And of course, I studied in France, so I could speak French with older people. And there was also a community cultural revival going on there, self-generated, like Jimmy Difford. And I saw similarities and differences there. But there was a local lawyer and a local school teacher who were good friends, both of them Cajuns, who had a sense of defiance about Cajun culture being important and good and not something that should be rubbed out, as a lot of would-be educators insisted it should be.
Right.
And so I just built on what they had started there and immediately went back there after the 64 festival. But the 64 festival was a real watershed. It was the results of my first forays into the field for Newport. And I went out, I guess, in late February, early March, and found fiddlers and blues singers and this kind of pipes player and just all kinds of stuff. So the 64 Newport Folk Festival was quantum leaps ahead of what 63 or any other Newport Festival had been. Not by my assessment. I mean, anybody can just look at the program of it. It was just incredible array. Cajun, that was the first time they had Cajun music there. It was just an incredible array of new stuff and old stuff, Library of Congress stuff, and stuff that no one had ever heard of. Who had ever heard of a person playing panpipes in this country? 10 notes. And I have a set of them over at the other house at Bates House, which was made by that guy. And out of that, of course, Newport was, the 64 was the year that Bob Dylan electrified his band. There were a lot of things that happened in 64. That was the year he went electric. It was a very significant year with the Philadelphia, Mississippi, Harvard years, the Civil Rights Movement. But it was the beginning for me of figuring out how to do community cultural renewal. Of course, I'd already, the reason I got the job and was recommended by Lomax, asked by Lomax to do this, was that I had already gone down and recorded an old-time banjo player, Clements Ashley, who introduced me to Doc Watson, who was then a side man in the rockabilly band, and talked him into being a folk singer, because I didn't know how to promote rockabilly musicians.
No, it wasn't why.
Well, he was a great folk musician, and I didn't know what to do with rockabilly, but I certainly knew what to do with folk. So, I had had a track record in looking at community, and there was a lot of material culture and general cultural history right there that I wasn't aware of. But my involvement with Newport and with the revival was primarily as a person working as an activist, as a cultural activist. Even when I was in graduate school, I saw that with Lloyd and Paul when I was living in Franklin at Lloyd's house. They were aware of the need to anglify the folks on revival there. Lomax's impact had been to make everybody in England play the guitar, trying to imitate Led Belly and Woody. And Lloyd and McCall came along and wanted to make people aware of their Scots, Irish, and English roots. So I'd been deeply immersed in all sorts of models for revival, and Charles Seeger had talked to me and sent me articles that he'd written on cultural renewal. And I was aware of the intellectual patterns without having studied folklore. The intellectual patterns that Lomax and Seeger and Lloyd and McCall, others, had thought through over the previous 20, 30 years. Where do you want to take it from
When
there?
you say intellectual patterns, I would like to. I'm not
Well,
sure how you
the
express it.
the basic idea is that people have a right to their own culture, that there is no national culture, that in fact culture is a patchwork, that a proper education in school has to deal with what's relevant to the roots and styles of the families who produce the children that are there, and that to impose Western European art music or the national musics of a country on children without being sensitive to the music that they grew up with at home or in their community was not to really properly educate them. And those patterns go back to 19th century Europe. People were aware of folklore from the time of the Brother Grimm in the early 19th century, and the Swedes, the middle and end of the 19th century, had already developed folk life as a discipline and perspective. Skansen, National Museum of Sweden, Folk Museum, was in place before we even started thinking about folklore in this country, when we barely had started thinking. Well, those are the intellectual patterns I think of. Charles Seeger had written his article a decade or so earlier, Folk Music in the Schools of the Highly Industrialized Society, which is published in his collected works now. He sent that to me. Well, there was a movement that was global in a sense, or certainly European and American, dealing with the Japanese were doing it, the Hungarians were doing it, dealing with the importance of local culture and the importance of the establishment recognizement. That's what I think about that.
You talked about community organizing, and I understood you to talk about it in connection with your work on behalf of Newport, and I'm not sure what the interplay was. I understood your reference to what Jimmy Driftwood was doing, but I'm not sure what you and Newport were doing. In that
Well, what I
context.
specifically did right after that 864 trip in the spring, which led to us bringing Cajun musicians and my finding amongst the bouquet of people that I met in Louisiana, Jimmy Balfour, who was kind of the Cajun Doc Watson in a sense. Highly sensitive, articulate, brilliant, committed to his root culture, very much an advocate for it. I went back and met him again, and the very first day that we had met each other, since he came to Newport in October of '64, he sang to me a 5-note tune, a pentatonic tune. It was very archaic, very beautiful. Obviously came from France. The French equivalent of the child ballads. And I wrote it down. I didn't have a tape recorder with me, I just wrote it down. I was terribly excited to see it, to hear it. And I started recording him and doing with him and his family. He told me that his family used to play music, but he was playing in a pop Cajun band with an electric pickup on his fiddle, very much like Doc. And that he was doing this because no one was interested in this old, as they called it, chank-a-chank stuff. And many years later, when he knew me better, he confessed to me that people in the community told him not to go to Newport because what we were really going to do is bring that old chank-a-chank music up there so people could laugh at it. And that's in a quote, he didn't tell me that actually, he told it to Frank Crochan, and it was in an article that Frank wrote. And he said he wept when he stood up for 15,000 people at Newport and got a standing ovation after playing the first Cajun song at a festival, because he realized that this community was wrong, that playing that music in that way was not an embarrassment to his people, although he had it knuckle wrapped this music in the studio.
But you had to convince him when you were down there? Did you?
No,
what did
I
you
mean, I just
say?
said, he trusted me. But then as soon as I left, a lot of people said these people are bringing me up to ridicule. Well, I went back after the festival and started doing the same kind of musical archaeology, if you will, with Dewey's brothers who hadn't played together for years. Probing for the oldest sounds, the oldest songs, the songs that connected to their family and to their earliest recollections. I mean, recorded beautiful stuff, like the ancient sound. It sounded like medieval France, some of it. At the same time, to specifically focus on the kind of organizational structure, I talked to people in political life. There was a French American Cajun Secretary of State, Roy Theriot, Secretary of State for the state of Louisiana. This lawyer and school teacher who lived in Mamou that I'd been sent to see by Alan and Harry Oster, who had done my book before when he was at LSU, were interested in the possibility of an organization, and I talked to people at the university. So I drew on three bodies of three groups in the community: the musicians, big-time politicians, and small-time politicians, the academics, and the local community organizers and the savants. And I put together what I called Louisiana Folk Foundation, and not Cajun, but Louisiana. And that meant you could have Anglo and Afro and Franco-American stuff. And on the board of that, I got the Secretary of State to put his name to it, although obviously didn't need to cover any means, and the local school teacher and lawyer, two people from the University of Louisiana, and professors, and some local musicians. And it was a strange agglomeration of people from the point of view of any group in the unit, and the two people in the unit, but they hung together and started using a mix of money, $15,000, $20,000, $50,000, to start music awards at the local parish, or county, I call it parishes, harvest events. So at the Hog Festival in one parish, you'd have a music competition and people would get $500 or whatever for playing the oldest tune, and another person would get $500 for the best singing style, and the next for the most archaic fiddle tune, always focusing on elements other than what would be stressed by the Nashville types who were trying to get imitation to see Newman, trying to make it big. And the Louisiana Folk Foundation put its name on these events, and there was a structure which involved academia, political life, and community life. So that's what I mean by organizing. And it had a letterhead, and there was credibility to it. Now in that community there's archives and a university, and it took forever to get the community to accept the possibility that Cajun French was acceptable.
And would Newport provide seed money for this?
Oh yeah, that's exactly what Newport did.
Okay.
And then a year later, hired Julius Lester to do the same thing in the black community. Realizing that I was never going to be able to do anything in the black community, that it had to be someone who had come out of the movement. And Julius and I worked together on that. And of course, on that I met Worth Long and got him into Louisiana. And then Bernice Regan years later. But the politics of culture and the cultural politics were very much a part of the thinking in the folk song movement, the folk song revival, in the area where I was working. So that what I brought in terms of experience and awareness to the Smithsonian, in terms of hiring people from specific cultural backgrounds to deal with that background in the field and establish and design a fresh kind of program within the Smithsonian to represent that culture came out of my experience in the books on the run.
What?
Let me turn on this one.
Sure.
Yeah, I can hear you.
What can you describe? I'm interested in the reactions you might have gotten from people as you were in the field looking for this. You
That's
touched
right.
somewhat on Dewey Balfa's reaction, which was a positive one, though his
They were all pretty
his neighbors were all.
Yeah, but one of the problems with working in the black community was that black people were not in areas of serious oppression in the South. We're not used to having white people come into their houses and ask questions and use tape recorders. So there were a lot of people who were worried about whether their Social Security might be cut off if someone came in who looked like a bureaucrat and asked questions and took the tapes away. Other people thought you were looking for moonshiners, and one guy tried to shoot me in eastern Kentucky. Literally. He was drunk, otherwise I might not be here on his own moonshine. Reactions were untrusting. Even when I started working for the Smithsonian, at that point there was no magazine, and people who didn't know what the Smithsonian was, never heard of it, wouldn't take a check from the treasurer of the Smithsonian Institution. So reactions were testy, by and large. People were interested. I guess I had an open enough means so that people weren't untrusting of me, but they wondered why a white person or a college kid from up in Yankee land coming into most of the places I went were south, although I later, within 2 years, started working in Nova Scotia, New England. The people wondered, they just didn't expect any organization with any money behind it to put $10 or $15 or $20,000 into their community for a bunch of songs that they've been told they should get rid of since they were children, in a language that they've been told they shouldn't speak. The Cajuns. And Doc had just abandoned that whole repertoire. Couldn't believe it. Doc's reaction was, when I first met him, was I don't play an acoustic guitar. I asked him if I really had come down to record this banjo player, Ashley, and I didn't know who Doc Watson was. And Ashley said, well, he hadn't revitalized his banjo style yet. He'd given it up and still hadn't, 20 years earlier, and hadn't brought it back up to speed, so he couldn't play, he didn't even have it then. He said, but Doc can play on the electric guitar. I said, I can't play on the guitar. He said, finally, well, if there's nothing else, could you play an acoustic guitar? Doc just flatly said, no, I can't. I don't have one. And if I had, my fingers wouldn't be used to playing on a different touch, and I wouldn't be up to par. So if he asked me to play tomorrow on an acoustic guitar, I guess I'm going to play at a great disadvantage. His reaction was very negative. It wasn't until the next day when I was riding on the back of a pickup truck and he was in the cab that he heard me playing a banjo to keep myself company as we had an hour and a half ride. And we got to stop the truck and came out on the back and played far better than I did. It wasn't until then that I began to understand that these people were multicultural, that when they would be playing hip-hop music sounded like national stars, but who they are and who they grew up to be, that is, was the very same people that I heard on the live recordings of. But you didn't know that. In 1964 was the dark ages in terms of any level of sophistication in the cities about this kind of stuff.
That's a good. I had a question about that, which is when this started. Now you said you were beginning this with the Ashgrove in '61. I have read that in the same year, the Chicago Festival in Chicago was doing this on a large scale. So I'm interested in when it began.
Move
What
this
the
back. What happened was Lomax in '41 took the field recordings that he had made in the 30s, started in '33, age 18. And he got the Library of Congress to issue publicly stuff that basically had been archived. He also, at the same time, his father first, when he got the record companies, just Victor and Decca primarily, to reissue material that they had issued only a decade earlier, 15 years almost, to reissue it on 78 RPM albums for a folk song audience. So they had a vision of a folk song audience, and it was based on their ability to bring Lead Belly to a community. Margot Mayo had a community operation going in New York City. Lead Belly came to Harvard to Senator Kittredge's class. And the Lomaxes had a sense that there was a public out there that would find race records and hillbilly records interesting as folk song. They were the people who understood that there was no difference between what the Library of Congress was seeking to record and had started recording, and what the record companies got by chance when they were just trying to discover if there was a way to sell phonograph records based on regional cultural groupings. So the first awareness, to answer your question, of regional cultures as exploited by the record industry being reinterpreted and represented to a urban, sophisticated audience came about with the issuing by John Lomax, and I think Alan helped with it, of an album called Smoky Mountain Ballads on RCA Records. Now, earlier they had issued Lead Belly and Woody. They'd gotten Victor, I think, to put out Lead Belly and Woody. But that was the Lomaxes, well, it was the Lomaxes trying to exercise their role as advocates vis-a-vis the sophisticated American public through the media. Alan went on the networks, I guess CBS, and public, and he did his Columbia School of the Year. And he compared folk songs by having, what was the example that Pete gave us? Alan would get Pete to sing a song?
He had more than the show, but one was having people sing songs and then have Pete's father and other contemporary composers write symphonic works that used that melody, and they would then show the way that it could be used.
An art music interpretation of it on
But I
radio.
think he also, had other shows in which he just had people performing American folk music. But the broader context for all of that is the real consciousness of, well, first of all, there was a lot of government programs that supported, mural paintings and collecting your folklore and, making up radio plays from oral history and
The Index of American Design.
And the emphasis of all of that was that there was an indigenous American culture, that grassroots culture should inform the writing of novels like Steinbeck's Graph and so forth. So it was really a massive change in cultural consciousness going on there, and a lot of people saying, well, not only do we believe that we should have an American culture, but let's go and create it. Let's collect the material that's right from our own roots. Let's make communities aware of the value of their own cultural materials. And so the folk song part of it was just part of a much broader.
And we were talking about when people on a larger scale
Sure.
first started doing what you were doing in '64.
Well, Lomax's first did this reissue.
Yeah.
Harry Smith.
At the same time, no, well before that. The same time that Lomax did this, so 1927, years before Lomax's effort with recordings, Bascom and Marlins would regionally started the Asheville Folk Festival, coming out of a local community chamber of commerce kind of thing for the Road Festival in Asheville. That was a folk festival. And some people credit it with being the first folk festival. There's research that exists on this that Kenny can put his hands on it easily. During the New Deal, a number of people started doing folk festivals. Annabelle Mars Buchanan in White Top Mountain, Gene Thomas in Kentucky, and Mrs. Roosevelt would appear occasionally at these festivals and bless them as important cultural events. And art music enthusiasts from the city would take a ballad singer like Horton Barker and bring him to White Mountain. Blind ballad singer would get up and sing this material, that they loved it. So the roots of folk song advocacy were already pretty strongly established by the Second World War. I can't remember the names of all of the women, mostly women, who went into the field and worked with Bessie and the Sea Island Singers in Georgia. I can't remember that woman's name, but a very well-known collector who published the songs, the slave songs of the Georgia Sea Islands. There was a kind of cultural ferment going on, partly because of the New Deal, partly because of the kind of activism that the Russell Sage Foundation helped support with regard to the Southern crafts movement and Southern culture. Cecil Sharp's coming to this country from England in 1914, which led to his coming back a year later and reporting the Appalachians. Came about because Olive Dane Campbell, his husband was the head of the Russell Sage Foundation Southern Island social work movement in Appalachia, had notated some songs and taken them to Mr. Sharp when he was staying at Mrs. Starlow's house in Cambridge, summer of 1914. But that's all that left of it as well, in introduction to his books. And then a biography of him by a fellow named Fox Spangles. But the roots of what you're looking for in terms of a folk song movement and in terms of public awareness and intellectual awareness come out of basically 3 or 4 strings. One is the folklore movement. And the origins of that term and the etymology of the terminology itself is really beautifully done in a series of articles that Don Yoder did for the magazine which he started called Pennsylvania Folklore. And he did about 6 or 8 articles in successive issues on this very question, etymology of the word folk, lore, folk life, folk culture, and its derivations, its origins in European cultural movements, and its adaptation in this country. So you have both the academics starting in 1888. You have the settlement school movement starting around the turn of the century, probably. The schools where people like Gene Ritchie were educated in Appalachia, which were established by well-known society women primarily, concerned with the fact that this was the poorest region of the nation and the educational system was not adequate. The health system wasn't. So the Frontier Nursing Service was another part of that. So you have the settlement school movement and you have the craft movement, which went hand in hand with the settlement school movement in 1897. The English Society for Arts and Crafts, started by William Morris 10 years earlier, finally made its way to Boston, and Charles Eliot Norton, then distinguished professor at Harvard, was the first head of the Boston League of Arts and Crafts. And that craft movement was taken up by people like Olive Dane Campbell. And the whole awareness of material culture and craft as an important cultural expression made its way into the settlement schools and led to the development of the Southern Highland Handcraft Guild and the Council of the Southern Mountains. All of that coming out of the Russell Sage Foundation's work in Appalachia. And then a third area came out of the activity of folk song collectors and dance enthusiasts. Sharp came here both as a person concerned with music and dance. He was the lead. He was the composer for the music of a production of Midsummer Night's Dream. And he was selected because he was well known in England as the music tutor in the Prince of Wales, and also because he had collected original songs and pointed out to people that England still had a living traditional folk heritage of archaic music. And that led to the collecting done here by Sharp was similar to the collecting of Francis Child done in England in the 1880s. So between William Morris and Child and Sharp, you had a kind of fusion of concerns at the level of the intelligentsia, of awareness of the importance of hand-wrought objects. Morris's were not photographs by any means, they were very sophisticated. But that kind of cultural ferment laid the basis for the awareness of upper-class intellectuals and cultural advocates, from which sprang the folk song movement. But a lot of it was tied to social work concerns. Sharp himself was a Canadian socialist. And you can't really separate the strands of cultural advocacy and social welfare interests of the people involved in the dance movement, the song movement, health improvement, the frontier nursing service, the settlement school movement, and finally the folk song movement itself. Ritchie as a folk singer was shaped by all of that. His own awareness of the importance of heritage came from the fact that he went to a settlement school where Cecil Sharp himself had come to collect decades earlier. Does that begin to get at what you were asking?
Well, it does, yeah. It goes, actually, it went far deeper than what I was asking, and so I'm glad you went off of it. But I'm wondering, at what point in a large way, in terms of clubs and festivals, do people actually start bringing performers to mass audiences outside of the indigenous culture?
Then with Woody and Leadbelly.
Right.
And then, what, Sonny?
Sonny Terry played.
Matt Hart.
And there were Carnegie Hall concerts, early Carnegie Hall.
39.
In the 30s and 40s, yeah, we've read of those. Yeah.
He brought the Good Creek Girls and people like that to Carnegie Hall, based on, I think, the model that John Hammond had done at the 1937 jazz concert at Carnegie Hall.
Carnegie Girls played at the White House, the Roosevelt White House.
So they couldn't even believe it.
Who was the Newport board do the booking? Did they decide who was to go?
People would all bring in suggestions, and then they'd all vote.
Okay, how large was the board?
7
6,
people.
7 people. Was there an effort to diversify and also bring in some of the more popular commercial singers as well?
Oh, sure. Yeah, people were always looking out for new young people like Jimmy Mitchell, Dylan, Baez, whoever.
It's interesting because when you listen to all this, there's so much music history. When you see someone like the Bob Dylan take off to go to New York, it's a freaking
Well, I think what the impact of it was that it gave hope and aspiration to a lot of people, and then ultimately despair to some of them, like Bill. So everybody passing by, so many people, Paxton and Dylan, not Paxton, because they were around as Dylan, but they all started off at the same time, together, and within a year or two. I mean, I remember a program in some kind of union hall or something in the village, where Pete Seeger introduced Oakes, Dylan, and Spolstra, Paxton together. And I remember Oakes and Dylan were both on it, and it was a motley crew of us. That it was the highly paid audience, paid $1 or $2 to come in. And they were all equal. Like Pete was the old head, and they were all the kids. Dylan, Spolstra, Oakes. And 2 years, 3 years later, Dylan was on Columbia Records, and Oakes was still struggling. And 5 years later, Dylan was all over the world, and Oakes was still struggling. So, yeah, the impact of it was despair on many people.
What was the impact of it on people such as yourself, and I don't mean to necessarily personalize it, but to people who didn't necessarily think that that music had a place in a folk music revival? I don't know if I'm stating that correctly, but Archie Green said to us...
booed Dylan when he first came on Little Electrified Instruments at Newport. I understood. I wasn't
Well, some
there.
people didn't.
Well, even earlier, Archie Green described being taken, and I don't remember who he said took him, was it Robert Shelton? Okay, it was, yeah, taken to a club in the village to see this new hot young singer who was Shelton's pet, and Green didn't know who he was, and he went in and he sat down, and he said, "What do we need another Woody for? We've got a few, and Jack Elliott does it better, and we don't need him either." But
That was when Dylan was imitating Woody.
Sure, that was in the earliest days, and I'm wondering what. I'm trying to get a sense of two things. One for right now is what did a lot of people who had been doing the type of work you were doing and Alan Lomax was doing think of these city kids doing Woody imitations, topical songs, or even interpretations of.
Who felt doing it too?
You were.
I mean,
That's right.
Alan was a folk singer.
Right.
Ralph was in the Green
You were in the
Barrel.
Green Bible. Is this?
John Cohen was in the Ramblers.
Right.
I was never really that interested in that stuff. I was never interested in what the Green Bar Boys did particularly. I just did it for fun.
Way for you to play music.
Yeah, it was fun.
Okay.
I had to travel around free
Mm-hmm.
and see the parts of the country that I hadn't seen when I wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't think there's a single answer to your question. I think everybody had a very different approach. John Cohen seemed to have been fascinated by Dylan, and interviewed and photographed and watched that phenomenon with great sensitivity and interest. I never had much to do with Dylan. What the Newport planned is part of the program of it, but it didn't hold any fascination for me. It was just another person like myself creating his version of that segment of the revival. But I didn't have a strong aversion to it. I thought his Maggie's Farm and stuff like that when he started doing that electric stuff was better than the stuff that was closer to Woody and Dan Rock. But I think everybody had a personal relationship with reaction that was very different. And mine was basically that I wasn't terribly interested in any of that stuff. I had lunch with Phil Oakes one day, and he came over to my house, and I talked to him because I was interested in what he was trying to do. I was always interested in trying to see to what extent people would take tradition into new and interesting places. I said, well, here's what I found. What would you as a songwriter do with this kind of stuff?